only horizontally, but vertically, so that often, without even realising he was in the room, the first thing I knew about it, he was galloping up me like a squirrel. Like Solomon, however, he couldn't climb for toffee. One initial bound, and he was invariably left frantically swinging from something. In my case, usually hooked well and truly to the seat of my pants. With Charles, who was taller, he only got as far as his knees. Charles' yells at such times were quite unearthly. When, in fact, on Seeley's second day with us, Charles came hobbling into the bathroom, holding his knee and asking for the sticking plaster, I was really quite impatient with him. Shouting like that, I said, making all that fuss, because a tiny little kitten has climbed his leg. You'd shout too, said Charles, if you didn't have anything on under your trousers. And sure enough, under the single thickness of his trouser leg, poor old Charles's kneecap was bleeding streams. Poor Charles, he just couldn't win. He was sitting one night in an armchair reading with Sheba on his knee. Seeley had been with us for about a week by this time, and Sheba was slightly off her food, a bit overpowered by the boisterous Seeley, we'd decided. We must give her extra attention to boost her morale. Extra attention included coaxing her appetite, of course. So there was I with Seeley banished temporarily to the kitchen, feeding Sheba with bits of pig's heart on Charles's knee. She ate a bit, fumbled a bit, ate a bit more. By the time she'd finished, Seeley was howling blue murder at being locked in the kitchen. I was fishing bits of pig's heart from where they'd fallen down the side of the chair, and Charles was complaining loudly about his trousers. What he put up with for these damn cats, he said. His knees torn to ribbons, threads pulled on all of his clothes, and now pig's heart juice all over his trousers. I'd soon take care of that, I said, fetching a cloth and a bowl of water from the kitchen and briskly setting to work on his trousers. It was all right, of course, until the dampness penetrated. It was a November night. The water from the tap was very cold, and the moment it got through to Charles, he nearly hit the ceiling. Gosh, damn it, he said. What was I trying to do? Freeze him solid? Even Seeley stopped shouting and listened out in the kitchen. The next thing that happened was that Sheba lost her voice. It followed her loss of appetite, and we couldn't understand it. One day she was talking away confidingly to us in her usual cracked soprano. About we three were friends, weren't we? She was allowed out on her own, wasn't she? Little kittens were very silly, weren't they? And Charles and I agreeing with every word. And the next, all that came out when she opened her mouth was a tiny, hard to get out squeak. It had never happened before in 14.5 years. Perhaps it was delayed shock at losing Solomon, we decided, or subconscious resentment at our adoption of Seeley. Maybe all the chittering she'd done at him had strained her throat. Or was she perhaps jealous and trying to sound like a baby herself? We didn't call the vet. She didn't appear to be ill, and for the moment, the thought of the vet was synonymous with Solomon. After 2 days, in fact, her appetite came back, but not her voice. As the days went by and still she squeaked, we began to think that it never would. And then, a fortnight after she'd so suddenly gone semi-mute, Charles said excitedly one morning, "She spoke! She did, too! With a vengeance!" When I went out to ask her how she was feeling, "Wah!" said Sheba profoundly in deep contralto. She'd been a soprano previously. Eventually her voice did become lighter again, though never so high-pitched as before. Something had damaged her vocal cords, and still we put it down to probable shock. Until some weeks later, I happened to be having tea with Janet up the lane, and she said that her cat Rufus had been off colour. Wouldn't eat for days, she said. And then he had lost his voice. Not that he'd ever had much of one, but it had gone right away to a squeak. Her theory was that Rufus had picked up a germ from a stray cat she'd been hanging around with. Sheba, sniffing the garden in search of Solomon before Seeley came, could similarly have picked it up. It hadn't occurred to us that it might be an infection of some sort, as obviously it undoubtedly was. As we'd have suspected too, of course, if Seeley had also caught it. Presumably Seeley hadn't caught it because, having just come from his mother, he was still well endowed with antibodies. He was meanwhile engaged in other ways of worrying us, like trying to get up the chimney. Chapter 7. That was one of the very few ways in which he differed from Solomon. Solomon had never been the least interested in the chimney. Sheba had stood on her hind legs once and peered inquisitively up it, after which she decided a passing gnat was a lot more interesting, so she'd chase that instead, and left an ivy leaf trail of artistic black paw prints all up the sitting room wall. But other than that, it meant nothing to them at all. We put a guard over the fire when we went out, of course, and there were guards for safety's sake on all the electric fires. We had to watch those, I must admit, because Solomon was an expert at threading his tail through the cross pieces. I remember on one occasion someone asking me on the phone how he and Sheba were. "Fine," I replied, never thinking to cross my fingers. "Absolutely bounding. Not a single thing wrong with them for once." And no sooner did I put down the phone and open the sitting room door than Solomon, who was sitting in front of the fire, stood up, raised his tail, backed a step or two in his usual dance of greeting, and stuck his tail straight through the guard wires and onto the fire. It was all right. I whisked him away too fast for the heat to get to his skin. But there we were, not 5 seconds from saying how perfect everything was, with a horrible smell of singeing and Solomon's tail scorched in poker-work stripes that didn't grow out for weeks. It just doesn't pay to be complacent with Siamese cats. We hadn't been complacent with Seeley when, on his very first day with us, we found him clinging like a little white starfish to the top of the rounded fire guard. It was winter by now, and we had a proper fire. We took precautions at once. He was obviously heading for the 2-inch gap above the guard, so we got a piece of wire netting, wired it firmly to the top of the guard, left sufficient at either side to bend round the fireplace hood when the guard was in place, and with that at the top and a pair of heavy brass fire dogs wedged against the bottom, we reckoned we'd pretty well taken care of that little hazard. We had too, though I don't know which surprised people more, coming in and seeing the fireplace wired up like no man's land for no apparent reason, or coming in when Seeley was clinging to the top of it and one could see them thinking, "Good God, they've got another of them." Not only was the guard now pretty depressing looking, but it kept back some of the heat, of course. So when we were going to be permanently in the room, we took it away. Thus it was that Charles lit the fire as usual one morning, and then we sat down at the other end of the room to have breakfast. And Charles was just saying with his cup halfway to his lips that he thought this morning he'd get on with winter wash in the apple trees, when he suddenly yelled, slammed down the cup so hard it splashed coffee all over the tablecloth, and shot sideways up the room as if jerked by a string. I was sitting with my back to the fireplace, and for the moment I was quite bewildered. Only when I turned round and saw him flat on his stomach on the hearthrug, clutching a kitten as unrepentantly black as pitch, did I realise what had happened. "The fire," said Charles, "hadn't been drawing well. He'd just looked across and decided he'd have to relight it after breakfast. And at that moment, a spark flickered up from the apparently dead coal, hovered for a moment in the draught, and then soared like a star up the chimney. As it did, Seeley, who'd been sitting on the hearthrug with the wistful waiting for Santa expression on his face, which is why Siamese kittens get themselves on Christmas cards so often, soared after it, and Charles, thanks to the fact that he'd been looking, and also to the speed at which he'd moved, had been just in time to grab him before he vanished. After that, we had to keep a guard over the fireplace at all times, and as the old guard looked so dismal with the chicken wire tied to it, we decided to get a new one that fitted the fireplace properly. Wrought iron while we were at it, we thought, as we'd have to keep it there in the summer as well. As our fireplace is unusually wide to allow for log burning, we had to have the fire guard specially made, of course, and a pretty penny that little Siamese foible cost us. Seeley also differed from Solomon over the ever-pressing question of where he had his earth box. Solomon and Sheba had been born in the cottage, on our bed as a matter of fact. Otherwise, their mother had insisted she wouldn't have kittens at all. Thanks to her equally determined insistence that they had to be brought upstairs, because only there were they safe from the kidnappers she imagined were lying in wait for them round every corner. They'd spent the first impressionable weeks of their lives in the spare room. And there, as a matter of course, they'd had their earth boxes. As far as Solomon was concerned, it was more than a matter of course. It was a law of Medes and Persians. His box had always been there. He expected it to be there. If it was anywhere else, his stomach wouldn't work, and the entire village was told about it molto voce. After 14.5 years of following in Solomon's footsteps, Sheba also took it for granted her box would be there. Not for regular use, of course. There were super places among the dahlias for general digging, but for when we were out, or if it was raining, or at night when there were foxes around the cottage. Not so Seeley. He'd been brought up in a place where there weren't any foxes or traffic, and so they were able to have a cat door. He couldn't understand for the life of him why we didn't have one, but he knew jolly well where it ought to be, and when he wanted to attend to the wants of nature, which, since he drank so much, was about 10 times as often as a normal kitten, he made for the kitchen door and shouted at it. During the day, we could let him out into the garden, whither he scurried with great intent and usually dug a good 6 holes before he was satisfied that one was properly propitious. But at night, we put him in the hall and indicated the way upstairs. Seeley just couldn't get used to the idea at all. He hoped he wouldn't be blamed for being dirty. He would complain, his blue eyes round with concern as he seated himself in the corner by the window on his plastic washing up bowl. Even when he found he wasn't blamed, he still didn't like going upstairs in the dark. He was, after all, only a baby. He hadn't been born in the place like Solomon and Sheba, and venturing in complete darkness through a strange hall, up the strange stairs, and into a place that he knew his mother certainly wouldn't have approved of his using, was a very worrying matter for a little cat. So it was that we had to put the lights on for him and make encouraging remarks from the bottom of the stairs, while he climbed them very reluctantly, not liking to leave us behind. So it was that discovering a plastic bowl that looked exactly like his spare room earth box, only in a far more sensible place, outside the sitting room door en route to the kitchen, and therefore in the direction that cat doors and earth boxes were intended to be, he promptly started to use it. And thus it was that, having for years used a plastic bowl in which to keep small coal for backing up the fire, as being lighter than a hod and not so likely to damage the fireplace canopy when I swing at it and inevitably hit it, we now began to find it suspiciously damp. Sometimes, if there wasn't any coal in it, it was quite frankly awash. It happened so mysteriously too. But it was no good blaming it on the fairies. Leading from the bowl was always a trail of little black footprints. Then came the night when we had visitors, and Seeley, in this he was exactly like Solomon, was keeping very quiet in case any of them were planning to kidnap him. He sat around behind chairs. He lurked. He looked owlish. When anyone spoke to him, he didn't answer. Just his eyes grew rounder than ever. I put him out in the hall once in case he wanted his box, but a little white shadow slipped swiftly back round the door again and vanished under the table. It never occurred to me that with strangers there, he'd be even more reluctant to go upstairs by himself. It never occurred to me either that he couldn't possibly, being Seeley, have gone for 5 solid hours without paying a visit to his box. Eventually the visitors went, however lingering at their car doors to comment on the freshness of the valley air at night, on the mysterious sound of the stream gushing past in the darkness, on the ceiling of stars that shone like diamonds over the pines. Charles, seeing them off, agreed equably with every word. He didn't look so unruffled when he came back indoors, however. He only hoped nobody had noticed, he said worriedly. And when I asked, noticed what? He said, Seeley, using the coal scuttle. Seeley, it seemed, hadn't been able to hold on, and not wishing to disturb polite company, or which was far more likely, not wanting to go upstairs on his own, he'd done the only thing he could think of, an extension in his infant mind of using the plastic bowl, and used the copper coal scuttle in the sitting room. Charles had spotted him sitting in it with a look of unmistakable earnestness on his face. Who else had seen him? Goodness only knew. All we did know was that while Solomon himself had never used a coal scuttle, in principle, this was exactly Solomon. Seeley was, in fact, far more like Solomon than he was unlike him, and was following increasingly in his footsteps every day. In the way he looked, the way he reasoned, in his bumble-footedness, and very markedly in his ever-increasing desire to be an adventurer. I had quailed at the thought of that prospect from the beginning. All those acres of woods and moorlands and invitingly grassy lanes, and Seeley so very small, unaware of the dangers. Sometimes I wonder if that is why Siamese kittens are so white, so that when they set out on these inevitable treks of theirs, their mothers can spot them easily and fetch them back. The smudge on the nose that later spreads into the handsome Siamese mask, the little black socks that eventually become the elegant Siamese stockings, the dusky tipped ears, and the absurd little black matchstick tail that will one day be a slender curving whip. These they presumably carry to prove that they are Siamese, in case they meet up with another member of the clan. Nature provides no real camouflage for the young Siamese, however, who is unmistakably, outstandingly white, which only goes to show how well nature knows what she is doing. After his coming, there was a week or so of deceptively peaceful days when, if I let him out, I had only to glance out of the door, and there he was, gravely surveying the world from the wall adjoining the kitchen, or peering wide-eyed round the corner at the lawn. And then Seeley, like Solomon before him, was away, onto the hillside behind the cottage to begin with, where he stood out white as a button mushroom against the turf, a very tentative little mushroom, especially when he was stalking Annabel. And then she'd snort, turn round to look at him, and suddenly, to his consternation, the tables were reversed. He was fascinated by Annabel, had been ever since he first looked out of the kitchen window, and there she was, up on the hillside, like a great big perambulating furry rug. She was obviously the reason for his venturing onto the hillside, though it was one thing to be trailing intrepidly after a hairy monster, and quite another to have the monster looking at him. He would sit down then, Mum having presumably told him always to look nonchalant in time of danger and never to run away. He would manage the nonchalant part too, looking unconcernedly up the hillside, casually back over his shoulder, and every now and then glancing fleetingly up at Annabel, who towered, head lowered, above him. He would at the same time be trembling like an aspen, and patently thankful when I rushed to snatch him to safety. He persevered, though. When she came to the door for titbits in the morning, he would advance staunchly across the kitchen to sniff at her nose. Then he discovered that if he got on the table, He could very daringly waylay her ears when they reached the stage where Annabel, or so it seemed to us as onlookers, stood there with her ears stuck forward, deliberately waiting for Celie to play with them. His confidence knew no bounds. "No, leave them," I said the first time Celie walked between her legs as she stood in the yard, and Charles, afraid she might stamp on him, would have leapt to the rescue. And Celie ambled as trustingly as if he were going through a set of croquet hoops. And Annabel drooped her under lip benevolently, a sign we knew of old when Annabel was feeling motherly. And so we were encouraged to try putting him on her back. He took to it, as to the matter born, crouched flat on her shaggy coat for a better grip, and riding like that first for a few tentative steps across the yard, then through the gate into the lane, and eventually round the corner and up the steeply rising track to the field where she grazed behind the cottage. Father Adams was rapt with admiration when he saw it. "Regular little cough drop he's going to be," he said, as Celie swayed past him, clinging to Annabel with great concentration. He was right there. A few days of that, and our cough drop discovered that he could, after riding Annabel into her field, leap off her back, dash madly through her wire fence, and be up in the pine woods before anyone could stop him. There he would flit, deliberately tantalizing us among the trees. As he grew bolder, he began to venture into the depths. Charles hadn't put up the cage yet, partly because he hadn't got round to it, and in any case one could hardly pen a kitten on the lawn in winter. Better to let him exercise his legs and bring him in, was Charles's advice. It exercised my legs too. There I was experiencing the old familiar feelings all over again. The apprehension when I saw him belting up the hillside towards a tree line. The chagrin when I chased him and he just beat me to it into the depths. The frustration when I followed him and he nipped quite deliberately into a bramble patch where he knew I couldn't follow. And the panic when I called him and there was nothing but silence. There was also the heartfelt relief when, after ages of searching, calling and running madly up and down the lane to cover his possible exit points, there would be a plaintive little "ah" from the interior, a scampering in the undergrowth, and safe after all from the foxes and badgers and dogs we'd imagined him wait at every turn. A smudge-nosed little white figure danced light-heartedly into the lane ahead of us. Like Christmas, with all the bells ringing, was how Charles described the feeling. My mind was now several worries ahead, however. How long, now that he'd discovered the woods behind us, would it be before he started venturing into our own wood across the lane in front of us, and from there up into the orchard, where Charles kept those blasted bees? Chapter 8. When 2 years previously Charles said he was thinking of taking up beekeeping, I said, "Oh no, we weren't. We had enough problems with Annabel and the cats," I said, without adding bees to the mixture. It was for his fruit trees, Charles explained. They needed cross-pollination. They certainly needed something. We have nearly 100 trees in the orchard, apples and pears and plums and damsons and cherries. In spring, it is a picture that would inspire the most hardened artist. What with the blossom, the butterflies, and Annabel knee-deep in emerald grass. But come the autumn, we are always disappointed over the fruit. Due to the altitude, perhaps, or to the fact that the soil isn't really suited to fruit growing, or that Charles encourages the birds, and if they don't eat the blossom, they eat the fruit. "Lack of pollination," said Charles on this occasion, showing me the bit in his fruit book where it said that bees could make a difference as much as 40% in the size of a crop. I couldn't counter that, of course, and there is the fact that Charles likes honey and eats a pound to himself a week. So eventually I agreed to our having them, so long as they were kept right at the top of the orchard, I said, where they wouldn't sting me or the animals. And so long as I, personally, wasn't expected to have anything to do with them. Famous last words again, of course. The bees arrived one muddy day in February. The man from whom Charles had bought them, who assured him that he was giving up beekeeping because he was going to live in town, and not from any ulterior motive, came over to help with their installation. But the orchard is on a steeply sloping hillside, and a beehive with bees in it is very heavy, and, said their former owner, he'd nailed a piece of wood across their doorway to keep them in, but it would be just as well not to drop the hive in case the roof came off. That was logical enough. So, guess who had to tag along with the other two, supporting their ankles as they climbed so they wouldn't slip, going up through the mud? Right in the position where, if they had slipped, 20,000 bees would have landed on me like water tipped out of a bucket. We got them installed without mishap, however. And next day, Charles, immensely brave, inside the rather derelict bee veil he'd acquired along with the bees, took the wood off the doorway and waited for his bees to come out. It was some days before they did. There has to be warmth in the sun before the bees start making their first flight after the winter. But eventually Charles came back to report there were 1 or 2 out, and the next day 1 or 2 more, and a few days later that calamity had struck. There were a lot of dead bees outside the hive. Things weren't as bad as they looked, however. From reference to the bee book, it seemed that it wasn't due to any of the bee diseases, but they'd probably run out of food. It was necessary to give them supplies at once, though not, I imagine, at quite the speed that Charles insisted on, where, surrounded by unwashed breakfast dishes, I hastily made bee candy, while he stood by ready to rush it up to them the minute it cooled. It cooled pretty fast too. By the time I'd managed to pour 3 lots into saucers, the rest had set solid in the saucepan, and it took me days to get it out. Have you ever tasted bee candy? It looks exactly like white fudge. We liked it. Annabelle liked it so much that, having been given some of the scrapings, she spent the rest of the morning lurking on the slope behind the kitchen window, licking her lips and looking in to see if we were making some more. Most important of all, the bees liked it. Charles put it, a cake at a time, in the top of the hive. It took them a week to get through the first cake. After that, they ate it at such a rate that every couple of days, it seemed, I was making bee candy and chipping away at the saucepans. Eventually, I was able to change to bee syrup, however, which is far easier than making candy. Candy is for winter feeding, when the bees rarely come out at all, and if you give them food with too much water content, they foul the hive and die. They were coming out now, though, first in their dozens, then in their hundreds, and finally, as the weather grew warmer and warmer, in their thousands. It was at this stage that Charles, who by this time had worn a well-defined path up the hillside to watch them, noticed a long black tail proceeding airily up it one morning. Solomon going to see what was up at the top. Fortunately, it was a dull day for a change, and the bees were staying indoors, because when Charles caught up with him, Solomon was rubbing his head against a corner of the beehive and purring. There wasn't a bee in sight. But, said Charles, they were purring pretty loudly themselves inside the hive. That was the next thing. Rushing up the track after Solomon, who, having never gone near that end of the orchard before, which was why we'd put the bees up there, now acted as if he were an electric tram, and up the trail to the hive was the only possible way he could go. Eventually, he abandoned this in favour of a mouse hole by Annabelle's stable, however. And as Solomon had a one-track mind, and we knew that mouse watching would now be the order of the day for weeks, we were able to relax a little. All this time the bees were taking in the pollen, which they use in rearing their young. They carried willow pollen and hazel pollen and hawthorn pollen. I had to take Charles's word for how marvellous it was to see them staggering manfully up the landing board with a fat little yellow bag on each hind leg. I still wouldn't go near the hive myself. When at last I did see them working at close quarters, it was because the hawthorn was over, the elderflower wasn't out yet, and to fill in time, they started coming into the garden on the oriental poppies. They had a marvellous time on those. Instead of buzzing from floret to floret as they had to do with the hawthorn, the bees would get onto a poppy, scuff furiously on the stamens like a puppy scuffing on a doormat. This filled the bags on their back legs like an automatic hopper, and in no time at all the bee was off again. Burgundy all over where it had been burrowing in the stamens, and with 2 little bags of burgundy pollen slung beneath it like bombs beneath a plane. It was fascinating to watch. I might even have become a beekeeper myself if at that point Charles hadn't got himself stung. Not when he was up at the hive either, when in any case he'd had his veil on, but while he was standing at quite a distance, interestedly watching them work. A guard bee apparently got suspicious of him and came down to warn him off. Then it got tangled in his hair, stung him on the head, and when it couldn't get out again, and the first I knew, was his charging down through the orchard yelling for me to help him. That was sooner said than done. The bee was still buzzing madly in his hair. I didn't want to touch it, so I did the only thing I could think of and banged him on the head. It dispatched the bee all right. According to Charles, it nearly dispatched him as well. I hit him so hard, I drove the sting right into his head, he said. The bee was on the front of his head, and when I hit it, and the sting, when I found it, was at the back. But he always insisted I banged it in. Anyway, I removed the sting. He had a bit of swelling on his head, but it wasn't much. There was nothing to it when you got used to it, he assured me, with the confidence of somebody who, after trembling for days, had just plucked up courage to be vaccinated. And that's where I'm going to leave it.